The Vethkara had studied humanity for 11 years before they decided to invade. 11 years of silent observation. 11 years of probe satellites hiding in the asteroid belts of the human solar system, disguised as tumbling rock and frozen gas. 11 years of intercepted communications, decoded broadcasts, translated literature, dissected military records. They had learned everything. They knew the exact specifications of every human warship. They had mapped every orbital defense station. They had cataloged the yield of every nuclear warhead stockpiled on Earth and its colonies. They had run 417 simulations of the invasion, and in 412 of them, the Vethkara won within 37 days. Supreme Commander Valtheris reviewed the final simulation results from his chair aboard the command vessel under Sir Dominion of Stars _, a ship so large it cast shadows over moons. He was a patient creature by nature. 6 limbs, gray-green scales that shifted color with his mood, eyes the deep amber of old honey. He had spent 40 of his 120 years rising through the ranks of the Vethkara expansion fleet, and in that time he had absorbed 17 civilizations into the Empire without losing a single command vessel. He was not worried about the humans. They are emotional, his intelligence officer, Essi Kavara, had told him during the final briefing. Dangerously so. Their decision-making is frequently compromised by what they call compassion. They have been known to risk military operations to recover the bodies of already dead soldiers. They negotiate when they should fight. They surrender when they should die defending. They are, by any logical metric, a civilization that places excessive value on individual life. Valtheris had considered this. And their weapons? He asked. Significant, Essi Kavara admitted. But conventional. Kinetic projectiles. Directed energy weapons. Nuclear warheads. Nothing our shielding cannot absorb. Nothing our armor cannot deflect. Nothing our numbers cannot overcome. Then we proceed. The invasion fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the human solar system on what the humans called a Tuesday morning. 420 warships. 40 troop carriers. 12 command vessels. The largest single military force the Vethkara Empire had deployed in 3 centuries. Valtheris sat in his command chair and watched the tactical display as his fleet arranged itself into the expansion formation, a pattern refined over 800 years of conquest. He expected the humans to panic. He expected desperate radio transmissions, emergency broadcasts, possibly a futile defensive strike from their orbital stations. What he did not expect was the voice that came through on the open channel within 43 seconds of their arrival. Unidentified fleet. The voice was calm, female, young, by human standards. Valtheris had learned enough about human vocal patterns to recognize that much. This is Admiral Yarachun of the United Earth Defense Command. You are currently entering the sovereign territory of the Human Confederation. Please identify yourselves and state your intentions. Valtheris looked at Essi Kavara. That was fast. They detected our emergence signature, Essi Kavara said, and there was something in her tone that Valtheris couldn't immediately identify. Not quite surprise. Not quite concern. Something in between. Valtheris had prepared a standard declaration of conquest. It had been translated into every language humans used. He transmitted it. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then Admiral Chen said, I see. Give us 24 hours to consider your terms. Valtheris blinked. This was not in any of the simulations. Consider our terms? We're a civilization that believes in due process, she said pleasantly. 24 hours. You'll have your answer. He gave them the 24 hours, if for no other reason than pure curiosity. What happened in those 24 hours would only become clear to him much later. At the time, all he knew was that the humans did not use the time to evacuate. They did not use it to broadcast desperate pleas to other civilizations. They did not go into hiding. They spent it getting ready. The first battle took place at the outer defense perimeter, near the orbit of Neptune. Valtheris had expected it to last perhaps 6 hours. The humans had 17 warships stationed there. aging vessels by the look of their hull configurations, and while they were armed well enough, they were hopelessly outnumbered. The battle lasted 4 days. Not because the human ships were indestructible. They weren't. The Vethkara fleet tore through them systematically, destroying 14 of the 17. But the 3 that survived did something that none of the 417 simulations had predicted. They did not retreat toward Earth to regroup with the main defense fleet. They retreated sideways, drawing 4 Vethkara pursuit squadrons into the debris field of a shattered asteroid belt, where the human captains had apparently spent considerable time memorizing every piece of drifting rock and frozen metal. Veltharis lost 31 ships in that debris field before he ordered the pursuit squadrons to withdraw. 31 ships, for 3 battered human vessels that were held together, by that point, with what the humans apparently called emergency repairs and stubborn hope. He watched the tactical feed and felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. He called it tactical respect. He did not yet call it anything else. The second battle took place at the Mars defense line. This one went more according to plan. The human fleet was larger here, nearly 90 vessels, and they fought with everything they had. Veltharis watched the engagement from his command vessel and saw things he had not anticipated. Human crews did not abandon damaged ships until the last possible moment. In 3 separate instances, Vethkara weapons fire struck human vessels, and rather than attempting emergency evacuation, the crews patched the damage and kept fighting. One ship, a heavy cruiser that should have been dead after taking 4 direct plasma lance strikes, kept its weapons operational for another 2 hours through some method that Veltharis's engineers spent considerable time arguing about before concluding that the humans had essentially replaced entire weapons systems with manual alternatives on the fly. They improvise, Esovara said, and now the thing in her voice was unmistakably respect. All species improvise under pressure, Veltharis said. Not like this. We are watching them build solutions to problems that do not yet exist in our military doctrine. They are not following any manual. They are inventing as they fight. Veltharis said nothing, because he had noticed the same thing and it troubled him more than he wanted to admit. The Mars battle ended in Vethkara victory, but the cost was higher than projected. When Veltharis tallied the losses, he found that his fleet had lost 104 vessels against a human force that had begun with 90. He ran a new simulation. In this one, the humans won in 62% of scenarios. He deleted the simulation file and ordered the advance to continue. The third battle, what the humans would later call the Battle of Luna, was where everything changed. Not because of the weapons, not because of the tactics, because of what happened when the weapons stopped firing. Veltharis had positioned his fleet for the final approach to Earth when his sensors picked up an anomaly on the surface of Earth's moon. Not a weapon, not a shield generator. A structure, low, broad, marked with a symbol his translation database identified as a universal medical marker. A white field with intersecting lines. A hospital. And surrounding that hospital, on the lunar surface, were the wreckage of ships, both human and Vethkara. He zoomed in. The Vethkara casualties from the Mars engagement, those who had survived their ships being destroyed and had been recovered by emergency pods, were on the lunar surface. He could see them clearly. Approximately 400 Vethkara soldiers, many wounded, being transported by small vehicles toward the hospital structure, being transported by humans. Veltharis stared at his tactical display for a very long time. "Se Kevara," he said carefully. "What is happening on that moon?" She took a moment to respond. "They are treating our wounded, Commander. I can see that." "What?" Another pause. "Unknown. Is it a diplomatic signal? A hostage situation?" "They have made no demands. No transmissions other than standard medical communication between their field units." Se Kevara's voice had taken on a quality Veltharis had never heard from her before. Something close to bewilderment. "They are simply treating them. They're enemies." "Yes, Commander. They're enemies." Veltharis rose from his command chair for the first time in 6 hours. He walked to the forward viewport and looked at the pale sphere of the human moon, and at the small medical structure sitting on its surface, and at the tiny figures moving back and forth between wreckage and care. "Open a channel to that facility," he said. The channel opened with the soft chime of a successful connection. "This is Commander Veltheris of the Vethkara expansion fleet," he said. "I am requesting communication with whoever is in charge of the medical operation on the lunar surface." There was a brief pause, and then a new voice came through. Male this time. Older. Tired in the way that people get tired when they have been working for a very long time without rest. "Commander Veltheris, I'm Dr. James Okafor, Field Director of the Lunar Medical Station Alpha. What can I do for you?" Veltheris found himself uncertain how to phrase the question. In 800 years of Vethkara expansion, this question had never needed to be asked before. "You are treating Vethkara soldiers," he said finally. "Soldiers who were fighting against your people." "That's correct," Dr. Okafor said. "Why?" The pause this time was shorter than Veltheris expected. "Because they're hurt," the doctor said, as if this were the most obvious thing in the universe. "Because they're people, and they need medical attention, and we have the capacity to provide it. They are your enemies. They are currently injured," Dr. Okafor said. "The time to make decisions about who is whose enemy is when everyone is healthy enough to have that conversation." Veltheris closed the channel. He stood at the viewport for a very long time. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, "What kind of species does this?" The answer, as it turned out, was complicated. Veltheris did not immediately halt the invasion. He was not that kind of commander. He had orders, he had a mission, and he had centuries of Vethkara doctrine telling him that the compassion of a conquered species was ultimately irrelevant to the outcome of the conquest. But he could not stop thinking about it. He ordered the advance on Earth to slow, citing tactical re-evaluation, which was not entirely a lie. And while the fleet held position between Mars and the Moon, he did something he had never done in 40 years of command. He asked to speak to the enemy leader. Admiral Yarachin appeared on his communication screen, looking exactly as exhausted as anyone would expect a person to look after having spent several days overseeing the defense of her entire planet. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, by Veltheris's estimate of human aging. Dark hair cut short, eyes that were alert despite the exhaustion. She was sitting in what appeared to be a command center that had clearly taken some structural damage, based on the bent support beam visible behind her left shoulder. "Commander Veltheris," she said, "I've been expecting your call." "The hospital on your moon," he said, dispensing with formality. "Explain it to me." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm not sure what needs explaining. Your people are treating wounded Vethkara soldiers. Soldiers who came to conquer your world. Yes. This is not logical." Admiral Chun tilted her head very slightly. In the gesture Veltheris had learned indicated human thoughtfulness. "From a purely military standpoint, you're right. It's not logical. But humans have never been purely military. We're also medical and ethical. And we have several thousand years of hard-won moral philosophy that we've applied, imperfectly, but persistently, to the concept that suffering deserves a response regardless of the political context of the sufferer. Even when the sufferer came to destroy you, especially then," she said, "because it's easy to help people who are on your side. What defines a civilization is how it treats the people who aren't." Veltheris found that he could not immediately formulate a response to this. "I have reviewed the records your intelligence services failed to properly classify," Admiral Chin continued, and her tone remained entirely conversational. "The Geneva Conventions, the Red Cross, the Nuremberg Principles, 2 world wars and several centuries of global conflict that we put ourselves through specifically so that we could learn what we were and were not willing to do, even in the worst circumstances. We did not come to these values easily, Commander. We bled for them. We argued about them and died for them and occasionally abandoned them, and then came back to them, because it turned out we could not live with ourselves when we didn't. You believe that caring for enemy wounded is a moral obligation. We believe that medicine is not a weapon," she said. It is a different thing entirely. Veltheris was quiet for a moment. In 800 years of expansion, he said slowly, the Vethkara have absorbed 431 civilizations. Many of them fought us. None of them did this. That must have been a very boring 431 conquests, Admiral Chen said. Despite everything, despite the situation, despite the losses, despite the tactical uncertainty, Veltheris felt something move through him that he would later identify, after considerable reflection, as the nearest equivalent his species had to amusement. I want to see it, he said. Admiral Chen raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon. The hospital. I want to see it. In person. The pause that followed was the longest yet. That can be arranged, she said finally. Under a cessation of hostilities flag? Under a cessation of hostilities flag. I'll send you the coordinates. The shuttle that carried Veltheris to the lunar surface was unarmed, as were the 4 members of his personal staff who accompanied him. He had left Esikavara in command of the fleet with strict orders to hold position and not, under any circumstances, to read any threatening implications into anything that happened until he returned. Esikavara had looked at him with an expression that suggested she was concerned about his mental state, but she had agreed. The medical station was larger on the inside than it had appeared from orbit. The humans had expanded into the existing lunar facility rather than building from scratch, and the result was a structure that felt like it had been built with urgency and care in equal measure. The corridors were bright, clean. The smell was antiseptic and something else, something warm that Veltheris could not quite categorize. Dr. Okafor was waiting to meet him. The human doctor was somewhere in his 50s, heavily built, with dark skin and eyes that Veltheris found difficult to read. He wore the simple clothing of a medical worker and carried nothing that could be construed as a weapon. His handshake, a human greeting gesture Veltheris had studied but never experienced, was firm and dry. "Welcome, Commander," Dr. Okafor said, without apparent irony. They walked together through the facility. Veltheris observed everything. The human wounded were in one section, separated from the Vethkara wounded by a corridor rather than a wall, close enough for the staff to move quickly between them, far enough to allow privacy. The Vethkara soldiers, the ones who were conscious and alert enough to have reactions, watched the human doctors with expressions Veltheris recognized as deeply unsettled. They were warriors. They had been trained to expect captivity to mean interrogation, deprivation, potentially execution. They did not know what to do with the reality of human nurses bringing them food and checking their injuries with careful hands. One young Vethkara soldier, barely past his first military assignment, by the look of his scale pattern, was being attended to by a human medical technician who could not have been much older. She was talking to him as she worked, and Veltheris paused to listen. She was not talking about the war or the invasion or the politics of the situation. She was talking about her home, a place called Oregon, apparently, with something called forests and a river she had spent her childhood swimming in. The young soldier could not understand her. His translation implant was damaged. But he was listening anyway, because her voice was calm and her hands were gentle, and in the middle of a situation that was entirely beyond his understanding. Those 2 things were apparently enough. Veltheris watched this for a long time. "They don't know why we're helping them," Dr. Okafor said quietly, from beside him. "Most of them. They keep expecting something to happen. They are soldiers. They are trained to expect exploitation. Yes, most of them relax eventually." The doctor paused. "Some of them don't. That's okay too. You don't require their understanding, their gratitude. We don't require anything," Dr. Okafor said. "We just keep showing up and doing the work." Veltheris turned to look at the doctor directly. "Why?" he asked, and this time the question was different from before. Quieter, more genuine. Not the philosophical answer, the real one. Dr. Okafor was quiet for a moment, looking at the young Vethkara soldier and the human technician talking about rivers he could not hear. "My grandfather was a refugee," the doctor said finally. He was a child when his village was burned and he walked across 2 borders with nothing but the clothes he was wearing. He told me once that the first person who helped him, a stranger, someone who had no reason to care, gave him a blanket and some food and sat with him for an hour. He said that moment was the most important of his life, not because of the blanket or the food, but because it told him that the world still contained people who could see his pain and respond to it. He looked at Veltheris. My grandfather became a doctor. He spent 50 years treating people who came to him with nothing. He told me, the whole point of being human is to be the person with the blanket. Dr. Okafor gestured at the ward around them. So that's what we do? We show up with blankets. Veltheris stood in that corridor for a very long time. Outside, 420 Vethkara warships waited for his order to continue the invasion. Inside, a young soldier with a damaged translation implant was listening to a human girl talk about a river she loved, and his breathing had steadied, and the tension had gone out of his injured shoulders, and the look on his face was not what a prisoner's face should look like. It was the look of someone who, against everything they had expected, felt safe. Veltheris returned to his ship. He called his senior commanders together in the war room. 12 of them, the finest military minds in the Vethkara fleet, sitting around a table designed to plan the final approach to a planet's defeat. He told them what he had seen. There was silence. It is a tactic, said Ground Commander Rathvek, the largest and most aggressive of his senior staff. Psychological manipulation. They are trying to make us hesitate. They made no demands, Veltheris said. They received nothing in exchange. They treated 400 of our wounded and asked for nothing. Then they are irrational, Rathvek said. Are they? Veltheris looked around the table. Or are we the ones who are missing something? Commander, with respect, the simulation models are clear. We can take this planet. The losses will be higher than projected, but within acceptable. Acceptable to whom? Veltheris said. The room went quiet. It was not the kind of question Vethkara commanders asked. They asked about tactical parameters and loss tolerances and strategic objectives. They did not ask acceptable to whom, because the answer was always assumed to be obvious. Acceptable to the Empire. But somewhere in the last several hours, Veltheris had started wondering if the Empire's definitions of acceptable were as solid as he had always believed. Tell me, he said. In 800 years of expansion, 431 civilizations absorbed. How many of them are still producing original art? His commanders looked at each other. I am not aware that this data is tracked, said Intelligence Officer Esikavara, who had somehow found her way into the war room. It isn't, Veltheris said. I checked. We don't track it. We don't track what languages survive. We don't track what philosophies persist. We don't track whether the species we absorb continue to grow and change and generate new ideas, or whether they simply flatten out, become part of the administrative structure, and stop producing anything unexpected. Commander, the humans have been generating new ideas for as long as we have records of them, Veltheris said. Every decade, new art, new science, new philosophy, new political structures. They had a global conflict 800 years ago that killed tens of millions of their own kind. And within a generation, they had used the horror of that experience to build new international legal frameworks that changed how they treated each other. They learned from failure. We have not faced species that learn from failure the way humans do. They are still one planet, Rathvek said. They are still outnumbered and outgunned. Yes, Veltheris agreed. And they are treating our wounded because it is the right thing to do. Even now, even during the invasion. He paused. I have been trying to understand what kind of species does that. I believe I now have an answer. The room waited. The dangerous kind, he said. He did not order the retreat that day. What he ordered was a communication to the Vethkara Imperial Council, a transmission that took 6 hours to travel to the Imperial Core and another 6 for the response to return. In that 12 hours, the fleet held position, and on the lunar surface, Dr. Okafor and his staff continued their work. The message Veltheris sent was long and carefully worded. He described the campaign in honest terms. He described the losses. He described the tactics and improvisations he had witnessed. He described the hospital. The Imperial Council's response was, as he had anticipated, initially impatient. They wanted an invasion timeline, not philosophical observations about alien medical practices. Veltheris sent a second message. This one was shorter. It said, in essence, I am requesting authorization to enter formal negotiations rather than continue the military campaign. My assessment is that absorbing this civilization by force will produce an occupied planet. My assessment is that treating this civilization as a potential partner could produce something the Empire has never had in 800 years. He paused before transmitting. An ally that chooses to be one. The response from the Imperial Council took longer this time. 22 hours. Veltheris spent most of it in the forward observation deck, watching Earth, blue and white and green against the black, small enough that he could block it with one hand, large enough that it had produced, apparently, the most confusing military engagement of his career. When the response came, it was not an authorization. It was a question. The Council asked, what would be gained by negotiation that could not be gained by conquest. Veltheris wrote his answer carefully, because he understood that it was not really a military answer. It was a philosophical one, and the Vethkara Empire was not, historically, an institution that responded well to philosophical arguments. He wrote, conquest gives us a planet. Negotiation gives us what they know. And what I have observed in the last 11 years of study and the last 7 days of direct engagement suggests that what they know, including things they do not yet know they know, may be worth more than any number of occupied star systems. They are teaching their enemies compassion. In the middle of a war they are losing, they stop to treat 400 soldiers who came to destroy them. Not for tactical advantage. Not for propaganda value. Because it was the right thing to do. I have spent 40 years as a military commander. I have never once seen a species do something because it was simply the right thing to do, with no calculation of benefit attached. We have been conquering civilizations for 800 years. We have never once asked what we might be missing. I believe we have been missing this. The Council authorized negotiations. It took 3 weeks to arrange. The Human Confederation had to assemble a diplomatic team while still managing the aftermath of a planetary defense engagement. The Vethkara fleet had to maintain position in a solar system where the tension was, by any measurement, extremely high. There were incidents. A Vethkara patrol ship that strayed too close to a human defense perimeter, a human automated defense drone that misread a Vethkara resupply mission as an attack vector, but both sides pulled back from the edge with a discipline that surprised Veltheris. He mentioned this to Admiral Chun when they spoke, and she said, "We're good at stepping back from edges. We've had a lot of practice. You have a history of global conflicts," he said. "We have a history of surviving global conflicts," she corrected, which turned out to require learning when to stop. The negotiation itself took place on a neutral station positioned at the L4 Lagrange point of the Earth-Moon system, equidistant between the two bodies, technically in space belonging to neither party. The Vethkara delegation was led by Veltheris himself, which raised eyebrows among his peers, but which he felt was necessary. The human delegation was led by Admiral Chun, which raised similar eyebrows among human political observers, but which reflected the reality that she was the person who had managed the defense and therefore had the most credibility on both sides. Dr. Okafor attended as well, not as a diplomat, as a doctor. 3 of the Vethkara soldiers who had been treated in the lunar facility, the ones who had recovered enough to travel, attended with him, at their own request. Veltheris had not anticipated that. When he asked one of the 3 soldiers, a young intelligence analyst named Varshan whose left arm was still in a regenerative support brace, why he had requested to attend, Varshan said, "I wanted to see the people who helped me." "You saw them at the facility." "I was unconscious for most of it," Varshan said. I woke up once, and there was a human technician checking my vital signs. I tried to pull away. I thought she was going to. He stopped. Started again. She put her hand on my arm. Just her hand. And she said something I didn't understand, but the way she said it. He looked at his support brace. I want to understand what kind of people do that. I have been asking that question, Veltheris said. Have you found an answer? Partially. Veltheris paused. I believe the answer is that they do not divide the world into categories the way we do. We separate our thinking. Here is war. Here is medicine. Here is politics. Here is ethics. The humans seem to carry all of it at once. Their soldiers are also human beings who have families. Their doctors are also people who have fears. They do not turn off the parts of themselves that remember what it is to be vulnerable simply because the situation demands a harder role. Varshin was quiet for a moment. That sounds exhausting, he said. I suspect it is, Veltheris agreed. I also suspect it is why they're still here. The negotiations lasted 11 days. They were not easy. The Vethkara had spent 800 years developing a model for interacting with other civilizations that essentially had one setting: absorption. The concept of a mutual agreement between equals was something the Imperial Council had to be carefully guided toward, and the guidance required considerable diplomatic skill from both sides. Admiral Chun was better at this than Veltheris had expected. She was patient without being weak. She held firm on core human territorial sovereignty without making the Vethkara feel that they were losing face. She found points of genuine mutual interest. The humans had faster-than-light navigation technology with different trade-offs than the Vethkara version, better in some respects, worse in others, and the potential for collaborative development was something that actually caught the attention of the Imperial Council in a way that pure military considerations had not. But the moment that Veltheris would remember for the rest of his life came on the 9th day. They were taking a recess from the formal talks, both delegations exhausted, both sides at a point where further negotiation that day would likely produce impatience rather than progress. The humans had brought food. The Vethkara had brought food. They were, somewhat awkwardly, sharing a table. Dr. Okafor was sitting across from Varshin, the two of them having a halting conversation through translation software that was imperfect but functional enough. Veltheris was nearby, eating something the humans called a sandwich with cautious curiosity, and he was watching them. Varshin had taken out a small object from his uniform pocket. It was a drawing tool, something like a pen but with multiple colored tips, and he was drawing on the paper material the humans had left on the table. He was drawing the Vethkara homeworld, or at least the version of it he remembered from childhood. The great salt plains that turned gold in the dry season. The massive cities that grew like coral reefs on the edges of the cliffs above the sea. Dr. Okafor watched him draw. Then the doctor reached into his own pocket and took out his own drawing tool, a simple black pen, and he drew on the same paper. A river. Trees on the banks. A small figure on the bank that Veltheris understood was meant to represent a child. Oregon, probably. The river he had told Veltheris about. Varshin looked at the drawing. Then he added something to his own side of the paper. Water, drawn with the blue tip of his tool, spreading from the edge of the salt plain to meet the river in the middle of the page. The two drawings flowed into each other. Dr. Okafor looked at it for a moment, and then he smiled. Veltheris had studied human facial expressions extensively, but he found that he did not need the study to understand this particular one. It was the expression of someone who has just discovered that a conversation is possible that they were not sure was possible. What is that? Admiral Chun said quietly, appearing at Veltheris's shoulder and looking at the drawing. I believe, Veltheris said carefully, that it is the beginning of something. The agreement that emerged from the 11 days of negotiation was called, by both sides, the Luna Accord, named for the moon where the first unexpected act of grace had taken place. It was not a treaty of conquest. It was not a surrender document. It was, by any reasonable definition, the first partnership agreement the Vethkara Empire had ever signed in 8 centuries of interstellar expansion. The humans retained full sovereignty over their star system. The Vethkara gained access to a willing trading partner and, more significantly, to something they had not known they were missing, a civilization that could show them what it looked like to grow rather than simply expand. There was a formal signing ceremony, brief and somewhat awkward in the way that all ceremonies are awkward when the participants are still figuring out each other's protocols. Veltharis signed for the Vethkara. Admiral Chen signed for humanity. Dr. Okafor witnessed it. Varshan witnessed it. Afterward, there was what the humans called a reception, a gathering with food and drink where people were supposed to relax and socialize. Veltharis found this concept mildly bewildering, but participated with as much good faith as he could. He found himself standing near one of the viewport windows, looking out at the stars, when Admiral Chen approached him. "You could have taken this planet," she said. It was not an accusation. It was just a statement. "Yes," he agreed. "What changed your mind?" He thought about it for a long time before answering. "I have spent 40 years as a military commander," he said finally. "I have been trained to evaluate threats, to assess danger, to calculate what an enemy is capable of, and I am very good at it." "But," she said. "But I evaluated the wrong thing," he said. "I assessed your weapons, your ships, your tactical capacity. I did not assess your character. And it turns out that your character is the most important variable in the equation. Most military doctrines would say character is irrelevant if you have enough firepower. Most military doctrines have not encountered a species that treats its enemies wounded out of pure morality," Veltharis said. "When I saw that, I realized that we had been asking the wrong question. We had been asking, what will these creatures do to resist us? We should have been asking, what are these creatures capable of becoming?" Admiral Chun was quiet for a moment. "And what's your answer?" Veltharis looked out at the stars. "I don't know yet," he said. "I suspect the answer will take a very long time to reveal itself. Possibly longer than either of us will live to see." He paused. "That is not a concern. The Vethkara are patient. So are humans," she said. "When we want to be." "Yes," he said. "I have noticed that about you." 3 years after the Luna Accord was signed, Varshan submitted a formal request to the Vethkara Imperial Academy of Sciences. He wanted to study human medicine. He wanted to understand how the humans had developed their approach to treating the wounded and whether the underlying principles, the ethics, the philosophy, the specific idea that suffering deserved a response regardless of political context, could be integrated into Vethkara medical practice. The request was initially denied. Then Veltharis, now retired from active command and serving in an advisory capacity to the council, saw the file and wrote a short note. Underscore approved this. Underscore they approved it. Varshan spent 4 years at the University of Cape Town, studying. Dr. Okafor's team hosted him. He struggled with human languages and human food and the bewildering variety of human cultural expression that seemed to exist everywhere. In the music playing in the corridors, in the art on the walls, in the way people talked about things that had nothing to do with survival or strategy. He struggled most with the basic unit of human medical ethics, the one that seemed to underlie everything else. The idea that each individual life had inherent, non-negotiable value. Not because of what the individual contributed, not because of their rank or their usefulness, because they existed. This concept was not impossible to understand intellectually. The Vethkara had versions of it. But it was one thing to understand it as a philosophical statement, and another to watch a human medical team spend 6 hours fighting to save a patient who, by any practical calculation, was unlikely to survive and would never recover full function even if they did. He asked Dr. Okafor about it once. "Why do you continue when the odds are that poor?" Dr. Okafor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because we're not calculating odds," he said. "We're responding to a person. But if the resources spent on one patient who will likely not survive could be used for 10 patients who will, then we'd make a different decision about resources," Dr. Okafor said. "But we'd still make it with full awareness that we're not just moving numbers around. We're deciding something about what we're willing to do, who we're willing to be." Varshan wrote this down. He wrote down a lot of things. When he went back to Vethkara space, for years later, he brought with him 7,000 pages of notes and the memory of several thousand moments he could not have anticipated. Meals with Dr. Okafor's family, a human child teaching him to draw with colored tools, a single evening sitting by the river in Oregon watching water move over stones while a woman who had treated his wounds talked about why she had become a doctor. Her name was Sophia. She was 26. She had become a doctor because her father had almost died when she was a child and someone had saved him, and she had spent the rest of her life trying to be that someone for other people. The whole point, she said, by the river, is to keep the thing going. Someone helps you, and you help someone else, and the chain keeps going. Even if the chain breaks somewhere, you repair it where you can. Varshan looked at the water and thought about the drawing. The river meeting the salt plain on a shared piece of paper in a space station where two civilizations had been trying to decide whether to keep fighting. We have a concept, he said slowly. In the old Vethkara texts, before the expansion, before we became an empire, there is a word, _Velkath_. It means something like the carrying forward of a debt that can never be fully repaid, a responsibility that passes from one life to the next. That sounds like grace, Sophia said. Is that what you call it? Sometimes. She looked at the river. We have a lot of words for it. We've been trying to describe it for a long time. So have we, Varshan said. I think we stopped looking. 15 years after the Lunar Accord, the first joint Vethkara human medical mission deployed to a third civilization, a species called the Mirathon, who had been decimated by a biological catastrophe of unknown origin in a system at the edge of Vethkara territory. The mission was Dr. Okafor's idea. He was older now, mid-70s, moving more slowly than he had been, but with no apparent reduction in either his energy or his stubbornness. He had spent 15 years building partnerships between human and Vethkara medical researchers, developing shared protocols, arguing through the philosophical differences, and finding the places where the two cultures' approaches to healing aligned. Varshan led the Vethkara medical contingent. Sophia led the human one. The Mirathon had no concept of what was happening. They had been isolated for most of their civilizational development and had only recently begun to develop the communication technology that would have made contact possible. They had been through the catastrophe largely alone, and when two ships appeared in orbit, one Vethkara, one unmistakably alien in a different way, they transmitted urgent, frightened signals that the translation teams worked around the clock to decode. The signals said, essentially, _Are you going to hurt us? We don't have anything left to defend ourselves with. Dr. Okafor, who had been involved in drafting the response, sent back a message in the newly decoded Mirathon language. It said, _No. We're here because you need help. We have blankets. The translation was imperfect. Blankets did not map cleanly to any Mirathon concept, but the emotional content of the message apparently communicated regardless. The Mirathon let them land. It took 3 years to stabilize the Mirathon civilization to the point where they could begin to recover without continuous external support. During those 3 years, Varshan and Sophia and their teams worked alongside each other in the specific, unglamorous way that medical work actually happens. Long hours, inadequate sleep, equipment that broke down at inconvenient moments, language barriers that no translation software fully resolved, moments of grief when they lost patients they had fought hard to save. But also, the Mirathon child who recovered from a condition that had been considered universally fatal, and who spent the next several months following Sophia around with the specific devotion that small children show toward people who have saved their lives. The elderly Mirathon healer who had been working alone with what amounted to pre-industrial medicine and who sat with Varshan for hours comparing their approaches, discovering that their philosophies of care were more similar than the surface differences in technique suggested. The evening when the Mirathon began to hold a public ceremony to honor their dead, and the medical team stood at the edge of the gathering and watched a species grieve in ways that were different from anything they had seen before, and yet, somehow, entirely recognizable. They do the same thing, Varshan said quietly, watching the ceremony. Sophia nodded. They always do. The specific rituals are different. The grief isn't. Varshan had spent 15 years studying human philosophy by this point. He had read the Geneva Conventions and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and 2 centuries of human bioethical argument. He had sat through the lectures of Dr. Okafor and learned to think about suffering as a response rather than a problem. He still had not found one concept that adequately described what he felt in that moment. Watching a civilization grieve while the people who had come to help them stood quietly at the edge, present and witnessing and not taking up too much space. He thought of the word _velkath_, the carrying forward of a debt that could never be fully repaid. He thought of Sophia's word, grace. He thought of the river in Oregon and the salt plains of his home, and a drawing on a table where 2 species had first begun to figure out that they were not as different as they had assumed. "What are you thinking?" Sophia asked. "I am thinking," Varshan said, "that the humans were right about something." "We're right about lots of things," she said. "Which thing in particular?" "That the whole point is to keep the thing going." She smiled. It was the same kind of smile Dr. Okafor had given in the negotiation room, looking at the drawing of the river meeting the salt plain. The smile of someone who finds that a conversation is possible that they were not sure was possible. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." 50 years after the Lunar Accord, the Vethkara Imperial Council met to review the terms of the agreement for the standard half-century renewal. The renewal was unanimously approved in a session that lasted 11 minutes. The Council also approved, in the same session, the creation of a permanent joint Vethkara Human Institute for Galactic Medical Response, the first institution in Vethkara history to be jointly administered with another species. Its charter was short. Its mandate was clear. To respond to suffering in the galaxy, wherever it is found, without condition. Veltheris had been dead for 12 years by then. He had died at 134, a good age for a Vethkara, and had spent his final decades writing a memoir that most Imperial officials found deeply uncomfortable and most ordinary Vethkara citizens found completely riveting. It went through 17 editions and was eventually translated into 43 languages, including Marathon and all 11 major human languages. The opening line, in every translation, was the same. "I spent 40 years learning how to destroy things. It took one afternoon on a human moon to learn why that was insufficient." Dr. Okafor had been dead for 8 years. He had died at 83, still technically on staff at the Institute, still technically working on a paper about cross-species ethical frameworks in emergency medicine. His colleagues had found the unfinished paper on his desk and had completed it collectively, listing him as the primary author. The paper's conclusion, which had been drafted partially by Dr. Okafor and completed by his colleagues, read, "The discovery that another civilization operates from a premise of inherent individual worth is not a diplomatic achievement. It is a scientific one. It suggests that this premise is not culturally contingent, that it is, possibly, a discovery rather than an invention." Varshan was 81 years old when the Institute was created. Old, for a Vethkara, but not yet at the end. He attended the opening ceremony in the same lunar facility where everything had started, which had been expanded considerably over the decades, but had kept the original structure at its center as a kind of anchor. Sophia was 80 as well, and had spent the ceremony holding the hand of her granddaughter, who was 12 years old and had announced her intention to become a doctor. After the ceremony, Varshan and Sophia stood at the viewport that looked out at the earth below, the same view that Veltheris had once stood looking at while deciding whether to destroy it. "He would have liked this," Sophia said. "Dr. Okafor? And your commander? Both of them?" Varshan thought about this. "Yes," he said, though Veltheris would have said something precise and military about it, and then been annoyed with himself for feeling things. Sophia laughed. Whereas Okafor would have cried immediately and made everyone in the room feel it was perfectly normal to cry. It is perfectly normal to cry, Varshan said. He had learned this over many years among humans. I have done it myself on multiple occasions. How did it feel? He considered. Like a release, he said. Like something that had been held in too long finally finding the space to move. They stood there together for a while, looking at the blue planet. What do you think comes next? Sophia asked. More of this, I hope, Varshan said. More of going where the suffering is. More of showing up with blankets. Do you think the Empire will change? Really change? It was the real question, the one under everything else. 50 years of partnership was a beginning, not a destination, and they both knew it. I think the Empire is already different than it was, Varshan said. Whether that difference becomes permanent or retreats when the external pressure is gone, I cannot predict that. I am a doctor, not a prophet. But you hope. I hope, he said. The humans taught me that. Also, the capacity for hope is apparently not incompatible with a realistic assessment of the available evidence. Sophia laughed again, and it occurred to Varshan that one of the things he had learned from humans, possibly the most important, was the sound of laughter in the right moment. The way it cut through heaviness and made room for breath. That sounds like something Okafor said, Sophia told him. He said it to me once, Varshan agreed. The third year at Cape Town. I had just gotten a very disappointing experimental result, and I was, as the humans say, in my feelings about it. He sat down with me and said, hope is not a failure to be realistic. It is the insistence that realism has not yet had the final word. He looked at the earth below. He was right, Varshan said. The final word is not yet spoken. That is what all of this is. An insistence that it is not. Below them, the planet turned slowly in the dark, carrying its billions of lives and its thousands of years of hard-won wisdom and its imperfect, persistent, extraordinary commitment to the idea that every person who hurt deserved someone willing to show up. Somewhere on that planet, right now, someone was doing exactly that. Someone was sitting with a stranger in pain and saying, with their presence, _I see you. I am here. This matters. Someone was keeping the chain going. And now, because of what had happened 50 years ago in a hospital on a moon, that someone was not always human anymore. The chain was longer now, and it was still going.